Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a history so dark, so brutally honest, it will shatter every romantic notion you've ever held about the good old days. Let's slip back more than 500 years to Tudor England, where privacy was just a joke, and physical intimacy wasn't a source of pleasure, but a chilling life or death gamble. Instead of the fairy tales and luxurious silks we usually see, tonight we are going to unlock the door to the dark bedroom of the common folk, a place where married life wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was controlled by an obsessive church, monitored by an inquisitive state, and turned into a dangerous medical event that could literally end your life. Just think, the wedding night gift might have been a crude aid for marital relations, but that was the least terrifying thing waiting for the woman in that room. You are about to discover 101 truths, explaining why fulfilling marital duty in Tudor England was essentially signing your own death warrant, one time after another. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I love the way we connect across continents, diving deep into these dark historical tales together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Reason 1. Prayer in place of contraception. Imagine a world where the only barrier between a wife and an unwanted pregnancy is a whispered plea to heaven. In Tudor society, no pill, no barrier, no device existed to halt conception, only prayer. The Roman Church condemned every method of birth control as defiance of divine will, so women turned to the most desperate folk remedies. They tucked honey, animal fat, or crushed herbs into their bodies, hoping to thwart conception. Instead, they often invited infections so severe that wounds festered, pus spilled freely, and tissue died away. Some wealthier women sought out local healers, only to ingest toxic concoctions of resin, spoiled fruit, or even animal urine remedies that ravaged their organs and left them writhing in agony. Every night became a gamble with mortality. Conceive and face a 50 chance of dying in childbirth. Abstain and live in ceaseless dread of the next encounter. With germs and bacteria an unknown terrorscape, these contraceptives transformed their bodies into breeding grounds for disease rather than protection. All that remained was supplication to God, Buddha, or any kindly force willing to spare their frail lives. Reason 2. Childbirth, a roll of the death dice. Childbirth in Tudor England was no tender family milestone, but a grim game of chance. For every 2 women who entered the birth chamber, one failed to see the dawn. No anesthetics soothed the pain. No antibiotics tidied up infection. No post-operative care existed beyond rudimentary bandaging and prayer. Many expectant mothers penned their last wills and kissed their older children as they entered labor, knowing they might not survive the night. The creaking wooden floors of the birthing room echoed with wails that were less cries of hope than dirges of defeat. When hemorrhage occurred, when the womb tore, and no skilled hand could repair it, those medics who arrived, often carpenters or barbers with a handful of herbs, could only stand helpless or worsen the damage with crude interventions. Even survivors often emerged maimed, torn perineums, prolapsed organs, or chronic infections that marred every subsequent union. Yet society demanded these women rise from their straw pallets within days, return to household duties, and answer their husbands' demands for intimacy, all while their bodies bled and trembled. In the Tudor gamble, only the reaper ever won. Reason 3. Female anatomy, a burning mystery. Physicians of the Tudor era regarded women as inverted men, convinced the vagina was nothing more than a hidden penis. Their textbooks depicted female organs as alien shapes, more fantasy than flesh. When injuries occurred, say, a tear from rough intercourse, these experts often stitched wounds with horsehair and crude metal needles, unaware of infection or even which tissues they pierced. In labor, they might prod blindly, severing unintended vessels or rupturing bowels, for they understood neither the cervix nor the fallopian tubes. Without blood tests or ultrasounds, every diagnosis was guesswork, and every operation risked mortal disaster. Women became unwitting subjects in a dangerous anatomical experiment, their bodies a battlefield where ignorance reigned supreme. The tragedy lies not only in the pain inflicted, but in the utter powerlessness they faced. No advocate, no informed consent, only the blind trust that their bodies would appear on no one's map. Reason 4. Barnyard sex education. In an age devoid of guides or gentle instruction, young couples learned about sex from barnyard animals. Observing pigs, sheep, and horses at mating, they assumed the same rough mechanics would serve them. Absent lubricants or knowledge of tenderness, the resulting encounters often left women bloodied and bewildered, their membranes shredded, their spirits bruised by the brutality of imitation. There was no whisper of foreplay, no emphasis on consent, no sense that intimacy could be kind. Instead, each awkward trial became a fresh trauma, chipping away at trust and leaving behind fear. In this crude curriculum, women were taught that their bodies existed only as instruments of reproduction, not as vessels of pleasure or connection. Reason 5. The church watches the bedroom. Even behind closed doors, privacy was a myth. At confession, priests demanded intimate details. How often couples made love, which positions they used, and whether any pleasure was experienced. Only the so-called missionary posture earned absolution. All else merited penance, excommunication, or public shame. As these confessions piled up, parish priests kept mental records of who fulfilled marital duties and who strayed into sin. The bedroom ceased to be a sanctuary of affection and became a tribunal where every moan could be reported and every sentiment judged. With such surveillance, passion was replaced by paranoia and love by the fear of ecclesiastical retribution. Reason 6. No privacy whatsoever. In most Tudor households, every soul shared a single chamber. Parents, children, grandparents and servants, all packed onto adjacent straw mattresses. The notion of privacy for a married couple was a fanciful illusion. On the wedding night, the entire family bore witness. Curious children peeking from behind scant drapes, servants reclining on the edge of the pallet, and elderly relatives offering hushed commentary. Every soft moan became a communal secret, every rustle of shifting limbs a topic of open discussion by morning. Under such scrutiny, a wife's cheeks would flush with shame, her husband's confidence dampened by the thought of prying eyes. Without the sanctuary of seclusion, intimacy devolved into a public spectacle, begging for swift conclusion to avoid embarrassment. As years passed, many couples hurried through these shared encounters, their bodies bracing for abrupt ends rather than lingering closeness. The absence of even a sliver of solitude robbed women of the chance to explore the contours of their own bodies, silencing whispers of desire beneath the weight of communal judgment. This relentless lack of privacy ensured that love, if it dared to blossom, did so in the shadow of constant observation. Reason 7. No standards of hygiene. Personal cleanliness in Tudor England was a rare indulgence. Most people bathed only twice a year. Imagine waking each morning to crusted grime in your hair, the tang of sweat and stale beer clinging to your skin. Clothes, often worn for weeks on end, carried hidden layers of filth and disease. When a couple lay together, they shared more than warmth. They invited lice, fleas, and scabies into their bodies. Without antiseptic soap, even the gentlest contact could introduce infection. A tiny scratch might fester, producing foul-smelling discharge and relentless pain. Vaginal tissues left unwashed became breeding grounds for bacterial vaginosis and thrush. Conditions no one named, but many suffered. Women endured burning sensations and abnormal discharge in silence, ignorant of the true cause. Each union risked compounding these hidden illnesses, tightening scar tissue or triggering chronic pelvic infections. Within a society that demanded wives serve husband and hearth above all else, there was no provision for protective measures or basic hygiene, leaving countless women to pay the price with their health and comfort. Reason 8. No pain relief for intercourse or childbirth. In Tudor belief, suffering was sanctified. Pain in marriage and birth was a testament to one's faith. There were no anesthetics, no opiates, only barrels of strong ale to dull the senses. During intercourse, if the hymen tore or skin split, the wound was stitched with coarse horsehair thread, its entry and exit points gouging flesh without a draught of laudanum to soothe the agony. In childbirth, midwives or barber surgeons applied no ether or herb to numb the perineum. Instead, women bit down on cloth and clung to their own screams as they were cut, torn, and stretched. Any outcry beyond a whisper risked censure for immodesty. as agony was considered a virtue rather than a medical issue. Many mothers, believing that to ask for mercy was to question divine will, endured these torments in trembling silence. The results were lifelong trauma. Bodies haunted by memories of raw pain and spirits hollowed by relentless endurance. Reason 9. No concept of female pleasure. Medical treatises of the era described the female orgasm as a dangerous delirium nymphomania that might summon demonic forces. Any woman who admitted to pleasure risked accusation of witchcraft or seduction. As a result, wives learned to detach their emotions from their bodies. They mastered the art of feigned neutrality, treating lovemaking as a dutiful ritual. The notion that intimacy could be an exchange of tenderness and mutual delight was entirely absent. Instead, girls grew up believing that their reproductive functions were their sole purpose in bed, that passion was sinful territory, best left uncharted. Communities sometimes sanctioned crude surgeries to remove erogenous tissue, ensuring a wife remained a vessel for conception only. Without the language to express desire or guidelines to explore sensitivity, thousands of women drifted through decades of union, untouched by genuine pleasure, their spirits dimmed by a culture that denied them the simplest joys of touch. Reason 10. Marriage as an economic transaction. In Tudor society, wedlock was not a treaty of love, but a contract of commerce. Families negotiated dowries, as if discussing land or livestock, assigning a monetary value to a bride's virtue. The wedding night consummated not emotional bonds, but the final exchange of property. Futures promised, alliances secured. Grooms, sometimes meeting their brides for the first time, expected immediate compliance. Refusal was tantamount to breach of contract, threatening fines, loss of dowry, or annulment. In such a system, an affectionate caress held no weight against the rustle of gold coins. Wives, conscious of their role as economic instruments, complied out of necessity, not desire. Over time, marriage beds felt more like counting houses, calculating heirs, and preserving lineage than spaces of intimacy. Women, sold into stability and status, found their hearts constricted within financial ledgers. Their bodies, valued only for production, rarely had room for tenderness, leaving the landscape of love barren, save for the cold certainty of contract and obligation. Reason 11. Syphilis death sentence in the bedroom. Syphilis, known as the French disease, swept across 16th century Europe like a phantom plague. Its first cruel kiss was a single sore upon the genitals, which blossomed into fever, muscle aches, neurological collapse, and madness. No salve or salve could staunch its spread. Only mercury applied as an ointment or swallowed in bitter draughts offered a grim hope of cure. Yet this poison to kill poison rifled teeth from gums, stripped hair from scalps, and ravaged kidneys and livers before the disease itself claimed its final toll. Every wedding night carried the terror of infection. A husband might return from a tavern's shadowy chambers bearing the disease's secret seed. To seek treatment was to face public scorn. Sufferers were branded moral outcasts, their reputations and fortunes tainted. In Tudor minds, syphilis was not merely a sickness of flesh, but an executioner of honor and faith, relegating women to a fate worse than death. Reason 12. No understanding of sexually transmitted illnesses. While syphilis was whispered of in hushed tones, broader knowledge of venereal diseases was a void. The Tudors blamed noxious airs, or sinful indulgence, for genital afflictions, unaware that intimacy itself served as a conduit for infection. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, and countless unnamed poisons coursed through bodies unchecked, leaving women sterile, broken, and ashamed. Couples lived side by side, ignorant of their shared contagion, passing afflictions across beds and into the next generation. Infants arrived blind, deaf, or crippled by inherited microbial curses. Yet midwives and physicians invoked exorcisms rather than antibiotics. Communities chalked up deformities to witchcraft or divine chastisement, perpetuating a cycle of fear, blame, and futile rites. In this endless loop, women carried hidden burdens, bodily and spiritual, that no prayer could absolve. Reason 13. Treatment as licensed torture. When Tudor healers turned their hands to so-called remedies, they often practiced cruelty masquerading as care, a red-hot iron-seared flesh to expel infection. while poultices of animal dung and stagnant pond sludge blistered skin until fresh wounds gushed. Some dark practitioners inserted live eels into orifices, convinced the writhing creatures would suck forth corruption. These physicians, barbers, carpenters, or anyone with a purse treated patients as living experiments, indifferent to screams or loss of consciousness. Afterward, survivors lay weak and scarred, the original disease unchecked and their bodies further betrayed. Yet, for many, such tortures were preferable to inevitable decline. Better to endure agony than to await a silent, creeping death. Reason 14. No anesthetics for sexual injuries or childbirth. In any mishap, whether a tear from rough lovemaking or a complication in labor, there was no mercy in the form of anesthesia. Injuries were stitched with horsehair. Uterine lacerations closed with crude metal needles, all while patients shrieked. Some women succumbed to shock from blood loss as surgeons, ignorant of sterilization, plunged instruments into open wounds. The aftertaste of every remedy was earthy ale or weak herbal tea, never strong enough to dull real agony. Midwives and doctors balanced on the edge of desperation, wielding makeshift tools under dim candlelight. In this slow theatre of pain, death and disfigurement were expected co-stars, and any relief was paid in tears. Reason 15. Pregnancy test with a frog. To discern pregnancy, Tudor practitioners injected a woman's urine into a frog and waited 24 hours for the amphibian to spawn. If the frog laid eggs, joy or dread was confirmed. Though more reliable than many Tudor diagnostics, this test forced a woman into a night of anxious vigil, eyes fixed on a creature whose fate foretold her own. For a whole day and night her mind raced with questions. Would she bear another child into this world of hazard? Would her strength hold long enough? The stress weakened her body, increasing the very dangers the test sought to predict. Thus, the frog's uncertain ritual revealed not only her condition but underscored the era's cold disregard for comfort, thrusting women into a realm where science was still an act of faith. Reason 16. Misunderstood fertility cycles. In the soft, dim glow of Tudor candlelight, couples believed the days immediately following menstruation were the most fertile, while in truth, ovulation lay at the cycle's midpoint. This fatal misunderstanding sent countless families into a spiral of hope and despair. Newlywed spouses, guided only by hearsay, timed their union with desperation, only to face blank beds and whispered recriminations. When conception failed, the blame fell squarely upon the wife's barrenness, and rumors of witchcraft or divine displeasure swirled around her like restless spirits. In homes where superstition outshone reason, women were herded through ritualistic attempts at conception on the wrong days. Husbands, confident they observed the proper window, demanded compliance. Wives, anxious and exhausted, endured the strain. The emotional toll was immense. Sleepless nights, haunted by the ticking of imaginary fertility clocks. Days tinged with anxiety and fear of social disgrace. When infertility persisted, a visit to a healer often meant ingesting concoctions of bloodroot tincture or bathing in stewing nettles remedies as toxic as they were useless. Some drank flagon after flagon of spiced wine imbued with charms, only to find themselves battling infections or liver failure. In the end, the scandal rather than biology burdened the innocent, and women's reputations lay in tatters for lack of a hitch in their bodies' misunderstood rhythms. Reason 17. Miscarriage as unwitting murder. To miscarry in Tudor England was to commit an unthinkable crime. The involuntary loss of a child was met not with solace, but with suspicion and harsh investigation. When a woman's belly sank and life slipped away, neighbours whispered of a deliberate act. Magistrates summoned frantic declarations of innocence. Some women endured brutal interrogations, hands bound, limbs pinned until confessions of child murder were wrung from shattered souls. In fear of such draconian punishment, many hid their pregnancies until the final month, risking unassisted births and catastrophic complications. The irony was cruel. To conceal one's state to avoid accusation invited higher risk of physical harm. Women who dared seek medical counsel were careful to mask symptoms of threatened miscarriage, fearing that a midwife's testimony in court might condemn them instead of save their lives. No medical nuance distinguished spontaneous abortion from malice. All were lumped together under killing the innocent. The legal blade hovered over the bereaved mother, cutting off any chance of genuine grief or medical care. In this grim tribunal, women lost not only their lost children, but also their voices, forced into silence by the terror of wrongful execution for a tragedy beyond their control. Reason 18. No postnatal care. After the final cries of childbirth faded, a Tudor mother was expected to rise, wipe her tears, and return to daily chores within days. There were no midwives lingering beyond the delivery, no gentle hands checking torn tissues, no nutritious broths delivered to soothe her body. Instead, she was expelled from the birthing chamber, back into the chill of corridors where laundry hung stiff and cold. Lacking monitoring, many new mothers succumbed to postpartum infections, blood poisoning that turned warm wombs into seething havens for bacteria. Hemorrhage, a dire complication, was met with herbal compresses rather than surgical intervention, and many women bled out in silence. Those who survived spent weeks battling fevers, their cries of agony muffled by household demands. Society shrugged. Death after birth was God's will, and if a mother perished, it bore no mark on communal conscience. Children were bound to wet nurses or older siblings, their mother's absence explained in curt, hushed tones. In countless homes, the empty cradle and the hollow grief of kin remained unrecorded in official annals, a hidden toll of a culture that prized productivity over compassion. Reason 19. Breech birth as instant death sentence. When a baby presented feet first, a breech position, the risks soared to a grim certainty. Tudor midwives, armed only with crude knowledge, would attempt manual rotations by wrenching the infant's limbs into place. An act as brutal as it sounds. If unsuccessful, the mother faced a ruptured womb, and the infant lay strangled by its own cord. Without cesarean techniques or antiseptic procedures, both lives teetered on the edge of oblivion. Mothers might hemorrhage uncontrollably, their blood staining the birthing sheets, while doctors, often lay practitioners, stood helpless, drenching the floor in despair. Villagers heard the wails from yards away, the clamour a funeral hymn in waiting. Communities feared breech births, viewing them as ominous portents. Mothers who survived were haunted by the knowledge that their own birth process had almost undone them. Children, if rescued, bore the silent legacy of trauma mothers, forever etched by the horror of fingers fumbling in the birth canal, and midwives scarred by the memory of lives lost. Reason 20. Twins as witches' mark or adultery. To bear twins in Tudor times was to invite dread and disgrace. Twins were anomalies beyond comprehension. Some villagers whispered of sorcery, others of a father's unfaithfulness. Mothers of twins found themselves shunned, their faces shadowed by suspicion as neighbours crossed themselves at the sight of two infants in a single cradle. In-laws often demanded proof of innocence. The mother's bed sheets examined for signs of unholy rites. The infants subjected to superstitious rites to cleanse any malevolent influence. In some regions, twins were believed to bring plague or famine, and thus the family's status plummeted. Fathers, fearing social exile, sometimes abandoned their wives and newborns, leaving mothers to fight poverty, prejudice, and heartbreak alone. No legal framework protected these women or their children. Instead, the birth of twins became a curse rather than a blessing, fracturing families and consigning the innocent to lives of hardship. For mothers, the joy of bearing life was eclipsed by the terror of communal condemnation, a punishment harsher than any physical ailment. Reason 21. Menstruation, a monthly stain of shame. In Tudor England, a woman's monthly blood was deemed a toxic purge, or Eve's eternal punishment. When her cycle arrived, she became an outcast, barred from touching food, forbidden even to enter the village church, and often forced from her own bed. Families expected her to seclude herself in a barn stall or a dim corner of the stable, isolated like livestock. Beyond the cramps, fatigue, and mild fevers, the mental toll was profound. Rejected by kin, stripped of comfort, and left to bear her suffering alone. No shared burdens, no comforting hand, only shame. The enforced exile sowed anxiety and solitude each month, for fear of being branded unclean if she dared seek warmth or simple companionship during her most vulnerable hours. Reason 22. Prolapse, despair, and resentment. After repeated, arduous labours, some Tudor women suffered prolapse uterus or bladder slipping downward, sometimes protruding beyond their bodies. No skilled surgeries awaited them, only crude wooden or leather props to lift their organs back into place. These makeshift devices rubbed sores, caused relentless infections, and offered no true relief. Despite chronic pain and difficulty walking, they were still pressed to care for children, sweep floors, and attend to husbands' demands. Branded as frail or feeble, they felt the sting of social scorn even as they bore the brunt of domestic duties. When a single visit to a healer cost more than a farmhand's weekly wage, true healing remained an impossibility, leaving women trapped in bodies that betrayed them daily. Reason 23. No concept of postpartum depression. In an age without psychology, a mother's tears, despair, or anxious despair after childbirth were blamed on possession or ingratitude. Those suffering genuine postpartum depression were accused of harboring demons or rebelling against marital duties. Instead of rest or counsel, they faced exorcisms, forced fasting, and sometimes beatings to expel dark spirits. Many plunged into deeper mental turmoil, wandering in grief, or even worse, choosing suicide as the only escape. The community's refusal to acknowledge emotional healing compounded physical exhaustion, leaving mothers isolated and broken. Without a safe harbor for their hearts and minds, some never recovered, haunted by voices that branded their natural sorrow as sin. Reason 24. Baptizing the dead infant, a horrifying ritual. When a newborn died, church law demanded baptism before burial, turning grief into grotesque spectacle. Priests pressed consecrated water to a lifeless brow, traced crosses upon cold lips, and whispered entreaties to stir even the faintest spark of life. Mothers watched in agony as their babies' tiny bodies were judged for signs of soul, each moment prolonging their torment. Tears streamed down their cheeks, yet they could not look away, bound by piety to witness this violation. The ritual could last hours, compounding emotional devastation under the guise of salvation. In the hush of stone walls, bereaved parents bore the cruel paradox of honoring faith while enduring sacrilege against their own flesh. Reason 25. No rest before renewed duties. Scarcely had the nightmare of birth concluded when women were thrust back into labor. Their bodies, still slick with blood and strained from stitches, became kitchens for cooking, fields for toil, and cradles for older children, all within days. No midwife's gentle care awaited them, only the cold expectation to rise and serve. Husbands demanded their conjugal rights as if no ordeal had passed, and families expected hearths tended with the same precision as before. This relentless cycle drained strength, invited infection, and sowed exhaustion so deep it bordered on delirium. Yet questioning such demands was unthinkable. Womanhood equated to service, and any plea for respite was labeled laziness or ingratitude. Reason 26. Public virginity tests humiliation and execution. Before marriage, a bride underwent a public virginity inspection by elder women and kin. Stripped of modesty, she lay exposed, as attendants examined her hymen and awaited blood upon the bed linen. A single drop secured her status as pure, celebrated with relief. No blood, however, and she faced ruin. Her betrothal might be annulled, her family disgraced, her future cast into shadow. In extreme cases, failed virgins were shamed in the market square, or worse, delivered to punishment for lying about their chastity. This ritual carved deep scars upon their dignity, teaching them to fear their own bodies and to guard every intimate secret, lest a single night's choice condemn them forever. Reason 27. Female infidelity public execution sentence. In Tudor England, a husband's wandering eye might earn him nothing more than a scolding, but a wife's single indiscretion invited the harshest of punishments. A rumour, a too familiar glance with a neighbour, could brand her a traitor to marital vows. Once accused, she faced ruthless interrogation, beatings, starvation, even torture until she confessed. Then came the public spectacle. Bound to a stake in the village square, her body draped in a coarse black shroud, she might be hanged or consigned to the flames as the crowd hurled stones or rotten fruit. These executions served as grim admonitions to every woman. Step out of line, and your life becomes the community's dark entertainment. In their final moments, many women pleaded not for mercy but for the barest whisper of dignity. Instead, they were cast off into history as warnings etched in ash. Reason 28. No right to refuse one's husband marital sexual violence. Under Tudor law, a wife's body was her husband's possession. To deny him was not merely rebellion, but the theft of his conjugal right. There existed no crime of marital rape. Consent within marriage was a fiction. When a wife resisted whether to preserve health, out of pain, or simply fatigue, she risked more than a bruised ego. Chauvinistic husbands, feeling their property slighted, might beat their wives, file for divorce on grounds of insubordination, or denounce them to church courts as sinners or even witches. No refuge awaited these women, no shelter, no legal advocate, and no recourse beyond stoic endurance. Over time, they learned to dissociate from both body and mind, hollowing themselves out in private to survive each intrusive knock upon the bedroom door, where terror and duty lay entwined like chains around their ankles. Reason 29. Premarital pregnancy sentence of exile. A single girl who bore a child outside marriage faced banishment from her village, a punishment as cruel as it was final. Stripped of home and hearth, she fled to the woods or found refuge in strangers' barns, clutching her swollen belly and newborn against hunger and cold. With no midwife's hands to guide her, and no physician's herbs to staunch the bleeding, she risked fatal complications at every breath. If she survived, the infant often did not left to perish by chance or neglect. Returning home was unthinkable. The shame clung more stubbornly than any wound. Villagers crossed themselves at her passing shadow. Ministers forbade her entry to the nave, and neighbours whispered of her immorality. Thus, the scandal of a daughter's secret was buried alive in the hearts of parents who dared not speak her name again. Reason 30. Rape unrecognised, a crime against property. In the Tudor worldview, a woman's violation was a trespass against her husband's or father's property, not an attack on her personhood. The offender's penalty, a fine paid to her male guardian, reflected this twisted valuation. Recompense for damaged goods, as though she were a prized rug with a rent stained upon it. Her own testimony, dismissed as unreliable without brutal physical proof, counted for little. Worse still, shame and gossip surrounded her, suggesting that temptresses lured men into sin. Thus, countless women carried the secret of their assault alone, their bodies marked by trauma and their spirits starved of justice. The violator walked free, unburdened by remorse, while his victim bore both her silent wounds and the burden of a society that refused to see her fully human. Reason 31. Married woman erased from legal existence. The moment a woman wed, Tudor law effaced her identity. Under the doctrine of coverture, her legal rights, ownership of land, signing of contracts, control over her dowry merged into her husband's. She could not open an account at the moneylender, lease a parcel of farm, or enter a lawsuit in her own name. In courts and councils, her voice vanished. Her personhood became a footnote in her husband's ledger. Should he wish to sell property, she watched as her future was bartered away without a whisper of consent. When hardship came abuse, betrayal, or penury, she had no standing to challenge him, no means to secure her children's or her own welfare. Bound by marriage's legal shroud, she became invisible in the eyes of the law. Her autonomy surrendered at the altar before the candles were even lit. Through each of these cruelties, public execution for infidelity, enforced sexual servitude, exiling of single mothers, demeaning treatment of rape victims, and the erasure of a woman's legal self, Tudor society wove a tapestry of oppression that left women no sanctuary, no mercy, and no escape. Reason 32. Underage marriage legalized cruelty. In Tudor law, girls as young as 12 were deemed old enough to wed adult men, their childhood exchanged for roles of wife and mother before body or mind could be ready. The wedding night became, in effect, a state-sanctioned violation, a child's innocence overshadowed by marital obligation. Physically unprepared for childbirth, these young brides faced frightening complications, excessive bleeding, uterine injury, or infection that midwives, armed with little more than linens and hope, could not always manage. Society called such tragedies unavoidable accidents of matrimony, absolving the husband and the community from any duty to protect a child's welfare. Forced into domestic service almost immediately, these girls saw their dreams of schooling and self-discovery buried beneath layers of duty. In that gentle haze of midnight, where a child's sob might go unheard, their world narrowed to survival, bearing heirs on bodies still forming, while the promise of youth slipped away in the shadows. Reason 33. No choice of spouse, love branded a sin. Tudor custom dismissed the notion of love in marriage. Unions were contracts arranged by parents or clan elders, with brides given no voice in selecting their lifelong partner. A woman might marry a stranger, exchanging vows with a man whose eyes she had only just glimpsed. Emotional connection. An idea so foreign was labelled frivolous or sinful. When disagreements emerged, divorce remained a near impossible dream, trapping wives in unions devoid of intimacy. Over time, many retreated into silent resignation, learning to stifle longing beneath a curtain of duty. In the stillness of their chambers, hearts hardened with quiet grief. They longed for understanding but found only expectation. To serve family, to bear children, and to conceal any whisper of discontent. Thus, love, that gentle spark of humanity, was smothered before it could ignite, leaving women to navigate a lonely path of obligation without the guiding light of affection. Reason 34. Infertility witchcraft's verdict. In Tudor villages, a woman's inability to bear a son or any child was treated as a dire transgression, sometimes blamed on witchcraft or pacts with evil. Infertile women were shunned from church rites, whispered about as harbingers of misfortune for their families. The pressure to produce many children, economic assets in a world without modern welfare, crushed the soul. Desperate for relief, some tried remedies as strange as they were unsafe. Bathing in unguents brewed from dubious herbs, swallowing bitter potions rumoured to coax life from the womb, or carrying talismans meant to ward off curses. These practices often led to infection rather than conception. Instead of compassion or medical counsel, these women found only fear and hostility. Branded unnatural, they bore the burden of barren fields and silent nurseries, their worth measured not in who they were but in their bodies' failures. This harsh verdict turned an already painful plight into a lifelong sentence of suspicion and sorrow. Reason 35. Noble women's public wedding night, no solitude. Even royalty and aristocracy offered no escape from scrutiny. Noble brides were joined in marriage before a select audience, midwives, senior ladies, and clergy sworn to witness every detail. Consummation was not private, but an event to validate the union's legitimacy. Afterward, attendants inspected the bed linens for evidence of virginity, then displayed the stained sheet in the Great Hall as an official certificate. The bride's body, wrapped in satin and emblematic of her lineage, was laid bare to public record. Every gasp, every tremble, catalogued by watchful eyes. In that chamber of grandeur, intimacy was stripped of all tenderness, replaced by the hush of ceremony and the pressure of expectation. Whether queen or countess, a woman's first night was not a gift of love, but an obligation performed for an audience. In Tudor England, rank did not grant the blessing of private affection. Instead, it magnified the demand for proof, ensuring that no woman, no matter her station, ever held her heart or her body fully her own. Reason 36. Church, controlled positions, rigid ritual. Under Tudor doctrine, marriage intimacy was not merely permitted but strictly prescribed. The only sanctioned position was the so-called missionary posture, man above, woman below deemed the most efficient for conception. Any departure from this single formula was labelled sinful. Couples whispered their fears in candlelit rooms, knowing that experimentation with a different angle might land them in the confessional, forced to own up to deviant acts. Without exploration of gentler, more comfortable arrangements, intercourse became mechanical bodies pressed into a single template, regardless of mutual comfort or emotional connection. Women endured friction that rubbed raw, delicate tissues, leading to tears and infections that no midwife's poultice could heal. Over time, spouses learned to dread the ritualized act, their once private union reduced to a performance dictated by dogma, devoid of natural warmth or tenderness, and haunted by the threat of public penance. Reason 37. No concept of consent obligation over autonomy. In a society governed by rigid hierarchies, the notion of mutual consent held no place in marriage. Women were taught that fulfilling a husband's marital right was an absolute duty, regardless of exhaustion, illness, or distress. To refuse was to commit a grave offence, risking beatings, abandonment, or condemnation as a rebellious wife. The husband, holding the key to the marital chamber, claimed ownership of his spouse's body, and her voice, her preferences, her pain mattered little. Many women learned to feign compliance, hiding tears behind closed lids, for the slightest protest could unleash a storm of violence or public shame. In this atmosphere, Intimacy bred fear. Psychological strain built with each forced encounter, sowing seeds of trauma that could blossom into lifelong distress. Yet no one dared speak of the terror that sank them into silent despair. Reason 38. Bulky clothing barrier to intimacy. Tudor attire consisted of layers upon layers. Heavy gowns, tightly laced corsets, and voluminous skirts that could weigh 20 pounds or more. On her wedding night, a bride fumed by candlelight as she undid countless pins, layers of silk and wool peeling away like petals from an unwieldy blossom. Servants hovered to assist, stripping away privacy with every unsnapped stitch. Even in the final undergarments, thick linen stays and petticoats, the body remained ensnared in fabric. When the moment came to unite, the very textiles that symbolized status became obstacles. Friction from corsets chafed, skirts pooled on the floor to trip, and the bride could scarcely move without breath catching in her chest. What should have been a private, gentle act transformed into a struggle against one's own finery, leaving couples frustrated and reluctant to attempt intimacy again. Reason 39. No knowledge of lubrication, dry pain. The idea of using lubricants for comfort was foreign in Tudor times. Women's bodies, particularly during stress or after childbirth, often lacked natural moisture, making intercourse harsh and abrasive. A single encounter could tear delicate mucous membranes, leading to bleeding and scarring. Cultural teachings magnified the belief that pain proved submission to marital duty. A woman who did not bleed was suspected of concealing some improper secret. Meanwhile, the simplest remedies, vegetable oils or animal fats, were taboo, feared to pollute the womb or offend religious strictures. Many turned to saliva, but it offered little relief and could introduce infections. Left untreated, microtears healed into scars, narrowing the canal and compounding future discomfort. Caught in this cycle, women grew fearful of physical closeness, their bodies betraying their desire for intimacy through recurring pain. Reason 40. Pregnancy test with a frog emotional ordeal. To ascertain pregnancy, a Tudor woman delivered her urine to a physician, who injected it into a frog and waited for the creature to spawn. A single night stretched into 24 hours of anxious watchfulness. The frog's movements became her heartbeat, each hop or stillness a portent of her future. In this fragile vigil, she dared not eat or rest, fearing that distraction might mar the result. Anxiety gnawed at her as she awaited the amphibian's response. A positive outcome brought not joy alone, but dread a child on the way in a world of perilous births. A negative result offered no relief, only renewed cycles of hope and failure. This primitive ritual, though more accurate than many contemporary methods, exacted a heavy psychological toll, forcing women to endure an agonizing wait for an animal's reaction rather than receive compassionate medical counsel. Reason 41. Public virginity inspections, basic rights stripped. Before the wedding vows, a bride was subjected to a humiliating examination of her hymen before kin and midwives. She lay supine on a wooden table as attendants, sometimes including a clergyman or elderly matron, peered for any telltale tear or drop of blood. This ritual invaded the most private parts of her body, reducing her worth to physical proof of chastity. Success earned her hollow praise. Any failure could annul the marriage or condemn her to lifelong disgrace. In Tudor eyes, a woman's virginity was the sole inheritance. She owned a public asset to be verified, displayed, and archived. The psychological scars ran deep, as brides learned to mistrust their bodies and dread the very pledge meant to begin their new lives. Reason 42. Male infidelity, unfair tolerance. While a woman's single misstep led to public execution or exile, Tudor men enjoyed near absolute leniency. They frequented brothels, kept mistresses, or openly cohabited with secondary wives for years. Society excused this as a natural assertion of masculinity and power. A man's infidelity, at worst, invited mild social censure or a modest fine. No parish court hanged him. Yet the betrayed wife faced ruin, ostracism, divorce, or worse. This double standard robbed her of trust, honor, and security, illustrating a stark imbalance. Male desires protected, and female autonomy punished. In such an environment, women learned early that fidelity meant little when justice tilted so heavily toward men's whims. Reason 43. No sex education, bodies shrouded in mystery. Tudor society lacked comprehensive knowledge of sexual health. Female anatomy, vagina, cervix, ovaries was glossed over or cloaked in taboo. Sex served only procreation, not pleasure or emotional connection. Pain during intercourse, vaginal dryness, or waning desire were dismissed as moral failings or melancholy, with no expert to consult. Women suffered in silence, their wounds unseen and untreated. Chronic infections, trauma from rough unions, and mental distress from unexplained suffering. Without guidance or safe spaces to ask questions, they relied on hearsay and painful trial. In this void of education, vulnerability blossomed into illness, and bodies remained uncharted territories far from compassionate care. Reason 44. Reproductive control total prohibition. Any herb, charm, or folk recipe for contraception was deemed heresy, an affront to divine order. Women caught with pennyroyal or rue risked accusations of witchcraft. Access to knowledge about fertility cycle tracking, safe times, natural barriers was non-existent. Brides entered marriage blind to their own body's rhythms, guessing when to avoid conception. Many turned to dangerous practices, ingesting toxic roots, inserting foul substances, often resulting in deadly infections. The church and the law shut down even whispered talk of birth control, leaving women bereft of autonomy over their own lives. In a cruel irony, those seeking to delay childbearing were branded subversive, trapped by doctrine in an endless cycle of motherhood they never chose. Reason 45. Sacred calendar, sex on a schedule. Tudor women had to navigate intimacy by the ecclesiastical calendar. No relations during Lent's 40 days, on all feast days, or during other holy seasons. Couples charted forbidden periods as if solving a complex puzzle, lest they incur spiritual or social penalties for disobedience. A slip of the pen on the prayer book or an errant candle snuff could render them guilty of sin. Many pregnancies arose from miscalculations or stealthy encounters amid sacred observances, fueling guilt and fear. This rigid timetable turned love into logistics, fracturing spontaneity and infusing each union with anxiety about divine condemnation rather than mutual affection. Reason 46. Self-pleasure capital crime. Any sexual act outside procreation, including self-stimulation, was regarded as abhorrent, a mortal sin punishable by death in some Tudor jurisdictions. The belief held that all pleasure unlinked from bearing children defiled both flesh and soul. Men and women alike feared private urges, dreading that a stray moment of relief could be discovered and reported. Even in solitude, one might suffer panic at the mere thought of sin, for self-pleasure left no shred of innocence. This extreme taboo erased any sanctuary of personal comfort, filling lives with tense vigilance. In this world, natural desires became forbidden secrets, locked away under the threat of the harshest penalties. Reason 47. Forbidden to see one's partner faces in darkness. Under Tudor moral strictures, consummation was to occur in near-total darkness, candlelight dimmed or snuffed altogether to prevent any glimpse of flesh that might provoke illicit desire. Couples, guided only by touch, groped blindly in pitch-black chambers, unable to read each other's expressions or note signs of discomfort. A tender caress could become a jarring graze, as bodies collided without visual coordination. Women, denied even a fleeting sight of their husbands' faces or their own, drifted through these encounters with mounting anxiety, hearts pounding in fear of accidental harm or prolonged discomfort. In the silent gloom, the bond of intimacy eroded, replaced by awkward fumbling. Over time, this enforced blindness distanced spouses emotionally. Without the warmth of shared glances or comforting smiles, love became a whisper lost in the shadows. And physical closeness, a mechanical ritual shrouded in unease. Reason 48. No mattress, only cold straw. Most Tudor households lacked soft beds. Instead, couples lay upon straw filled mattresses lying directly on cold stone or wooden floors. This straw, often damp and mouldy, harbored mouse droppings, beetles, and mites that crawled across their skin in the night. As newlyweds attempted intimacy, they found themselves sinking into the coarse layers, unable to shift positions without discomfort. Bodies pressed together on the uneven surface, invited bruises and jostled joints. The chill of the floor seeped upward, tightening muscles and chilling spines. What should have been a gentle union turned into a struggle against the elements. The scent of musty hay mingled with sweat, and every cough or rustle from the bedding threatened to awaken half the household. Romance fled the scene, replaced by a desperate desire for warmth and relief from the harsh reality of a bed unmade by comfort. Reason 49. Shared bedding collective quarters. In the crowded Tudor home, entire families, grandparents, children, servants, slept in one great chamber, straw beds lined side by side. When a married couple sought privacy, there was none to be found. A creak of boards or a soft moan risked waking the entire household. Children stirred, giggles erupted, and servants exchanged knowing glances. Husbands and wives, mortified by the potential for interruption, rushed through union, bodies stiff with dread rather than softened by trust. The absence of walls or curtains rendered every sound an echo in the hall, and every movement a spectacle to unseen eyes. Women learned to stifle sighs and conceal any sign of pleasure, fearing gossip and shame. Without space to be alone, intimacy lost both its warmth and its sanctuary, relegating love to the margins of crowded rooms and hurried embraces. Reason 50. Rare bathing lingering odours. Bathing was so infrequent in Tudor times, perhaps twice a year, that bodies bore the imprint of weeks of toil, sweat, dirt, and the faint tang of fermenting garments. Underarm and foot odours mingled with the stale musk of stale linen. When couples came together, the first impression was often one of shock. Pungent aromas drifted between them, distracting from any tender connection. Women's intimate areas, seldom washed, accumulated secretions that fostered yeast and bacterial overgrowth. This led to itching, burning, and inflamed tissues that turned each contact into an ordeal. No remedies existed beyond wiping with a damp cloth, an act fraught with embarrassment, and so many women endured chronic infections. The very act meant to unite bodies instead repelled them with stench and discomfort, driving spouses apart and eroding desire beneath a cloud of unshakable grime. Reason 51. Parasites unwelcome bedfellows. In the unclean conditions of most Tudor homes, lice, fleas, and mites were ubiquitous inhabitants. When couples shared beds, even those scant straw mattresses, these pests scurried between partners, biting and burrowing into skin. As intimacy began, the throbbing itch from a fresh louse bite could eclipse any sense of connection. Women scratched until their flesh bled, only to find more bites blooming like tiny red flowers. These wounds invited secondary infections, and no healer's ointment could fully quell the rash that spread with each embrace. The psychological toll was brutal. The fear of invisible insects crawling beneath one's clothes turned each moment of closeness into a torment of anticipation. Rather than a haven of shared warmth, the bed became a battleground against parasites, where the primal desire for union clashed with the desperate need to escape relentless itching and the dread of further harm. Reason 52. Total darkness a threat to safety. With no electric lights and candles too costly, Tudor couples embraced complete darkness to save fuel. In that pitch black, partners stumbled over furniture, jostling each other into injuries, sprained ankles, bruised ribs, even broken fingers. The fear of sudden intrusion by children, servants, or curious neighbours added constant tension. Each gasp of wind at the window or shuffle of feet in the hallway sent hearts racing. The resulting stress sapped any spark of intimacy, replacing it with fear. Within those walls, darkness was not romantic but a cloak for dangers both physical and social, where a mistaken touch could invite scandal or injury in equal measure. Reason 53. Inability to fully undress fabric barrier. Tudor attire comprised dozens of layers. Shifts, petticoats, corsets, gowns, and farthingales. Removing each layer by candlelight took precious minutes, rustling and clattering in time with quickened pulses. Often, brides paused at a single slit in the corset or the hem of the skirt, exposing only the barest patch of skin. Even as the last garment slipped aside, corset stays and layered petticoats still bounded bodies in a stiff, unnatural embrace. That dense fabric barrier throttled natural curves and hindered closeness, forcing limbs through narrow gaps. When spouses finally aligned, the ever-present textiles created friction that bruised skin and stifled movement, reducing intimacy to a clumsy struggle rather than a gentle exchange. Reason 54. Lack of contraceptive knowledge. The Tudor Church forbade any discussion of birth control. Texts on herbal remedies or barrier methods were condemned as heretical. Women entered marriage with no understanding of reproductive biology, safe or fertile days, or how to prevent pregnancy. Rumors and hearsay filled the void, leading to desperate and dangerous experiments ingesting toxic plants, inserting corrosive pastes, or relying on superstitious charms. These measures often caused severe infections or poisoning, yet offered little protection. Without accurate information or approved methods, women were trapped in a cycle of unintended pregnancies, each carrying the peril of death in childbirth. Deprived of knowledge, they lost control over their bodies and destinies, forced to bear burdens they neither chose nor could avoid. Reason 55. Sex designed solely for procreation. In Tudor belief, every act of union had but one purpose: to conceive. Intercourse that did not result in pregnancy was deemed wasteful, even sinful. Women felt crushing pressure to become pregnant immediately after marriage, and thereafter during permissible seasons, their bodies expected to comply without pause. Failing to conceive swiftly labelled them as deficient in duty, risking social sanction or desertion by husbands. Emotional intimacy, pleasure, and mutual satisfaction were all subjugated to fertility quotas. Women dared not seek moments of affection or delay conception for health reasons. Their own well-being was secondary to their reproductive function. In this austere framework, love and longing were banished, leaving only the relentless march toward the next child, a conveyor belt of obligation that ground down body and soul alike. Reason 56. No heating bone, chilling cold. Most Tudor homes lacked a hearth in the sleeping chamber, and winter's icy draught seeped through stone walls. After undoing layers of heavy gowns and tight corsets, couples found themselves exposed to an air so frigid it made muscles contract and bones shiver. Skin pulled taut, blood vessels constricted, and every movement sent a jolt of cold through their limbs. In that frost-bitten hush, bodies sought warmth above all else. Love was secondary to survival. Intimate moments became hurried rushes against the cold. Couples pressed together briefly, then dashed to reignite the hearth or don their garments. There was no luxury of gentle foreplay or whispered promises. Instead, the union was a desperate scramble to beat the chill, leaving little room for emotional connection or tender exploration. Reason 57. Pressure to bear many children. Reproductive machinery. From the moment of her first night, a Tudor bride was expected to become a vessel for continuous childbearing, ideally producing a son. Any pause in pregnancy invited suspicion of disobedience, risking threats of divorce or confiscation of her dowry. Women's bodies received no rest between pregnancies. Miscarriages and births followed in relentless succession. Without recovery time, their strength ebbed away, malnutrition set in, and their health deteriorated rapidly. Each pregnancy compounded the damage of the last. Uterine prolapse, anemia, and weakened bones became commonplace. Life expectancy plummeted as women aged not with grace but under the weight of constant gestation. In that grim factory of motherhood, personal desires and well-being were sacrificed to the merciless demands of lineage and inheritance. Reason 58. Taboo of menstruation, shame and solitude. When a woman's monthly cycle arrived, she was deemed unclean and confined to a makeshift menstruation hut, often a cramped shed or abandoned stable. Cut off from hearth and table, she ate meager rations through a small window and drank cold water passed through a crack. Neighbors crossed themselves at her departure, whispering prayers to ward off impurity. For days, she sat alone in dim straw bedding, her body aching and spirit weighed down by shame. The social exile branded her as dangerous, even to her own family. This monthly banishment inflicted lasting psychological wounds. Women learned to associate their body's natural rhythm with guilt, isolation, and anxiety. Rather than a healthy cycle, menstruation became a recurring sentence to solitude and scorn. Reason 59. Postpartum hemorrhage, deadly aftermath. Childbirth in Tudor times frequently ended not with relief, but with a second wave of terror, excessive bleeding. Without knowledge of transfusions, antibiotics, or oxygen therapy, midwives relied on weak herbal compresses and pressure dressings. Some turned to rudimentary cauterization or cupping, which often worsened the wounds. Hemorrhages went unchecked until the mother's strength collapsed, her pulse fading beneath a pale face. Families, unfamiliar with the concept of life-threatening postpartum bleeding, chalked these deaths up to God's will rather than medical crisis. The result was a silent toll of mothers lost in the weeks following birth, unrecorded in parish registers, and remembered only as tragic inevitabilities rather than preventable tragedies. Reason 60. Numbness after trauma sexual aversion. For many Tudor women, the physical traumas of childbirth, crude repairs of tears, and forced marital duties left deeper scars than any external wound. After surviving a brutal delivery or a botched stitch with no anesthetic, some developed a profound aversion to intimacy. The mind learned to shield itself. Nerves dulled, sensations faded, and what should have brought closeness instead conjured flashbacks of pain. Husbands felt the sudden chill of rejection, blaming wives for coldness rather than understanding the ghost of trauma that froze their desires. Without concept of psychological care or therapy, these women suffered alone, cut off from both their bodies and their spouses. Marriages frayed as intimacy ceased, leaving hearts wounded by memory, trapped in a cycle of fear and isolation that no candlelight could ever dispel. Reason 61. Poor nutritional regimen. In Tudor households, meals revolved around coarse rye bread, boiled greens, and the occasional slice of salted or smoked meat. Fresh produce was scarce, and dairy products were often sour or spoiled. Without access to red meats or iron-rich legumes, many women developed severe anemia, their blood unable to carry enough oxygen to trembling muscles. Vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Scurvy's bleeding gums, rickets' bowed limbs, and pellagra's dermatitis all took their toll. A lack of protein and essential fats left bodies frail, exhaustion settling into every bone. When couples attempted intimacy, women flitted between dizziness and heart palpitations, their knees buckling beneath them. During childbirth, these very bodies collapsed under the strain, hemorrhages more likely to prove fatal. In an age where energy was scarce, both lovemaking and labour became battles against malnourishment, each heartbeat a reminder of an empty plate rather than a full life. Reason 62. Tooth loss aesthetic and health stigma. Dentistry was non-existent in Tudor England. Toothaches were treated with nothing more than herbal poultices or the crude extraction by blacksmiths. By their mid-30s, many women bore half-empty jaws, blackened stumps of decay, and gums receding like tide lines. Their breath carried the acrid tang of rot, repelling anyone who drew near. When husbands dared a tender kiss, they encountered a stench so pungent it stifled passion. With chewing power diminished, meals became softer porridge and pottage, yet even these could spark fresh pain. Social gatherings buzzed with whispers about a woman's foul-smelling breath or gapped smile, sowing embarrassment. In private chambers, the loss of dental dignity cast a pall over intimacy as women shrank beneath the shame of their own mouths, longing for comfort but fearing its close approach. Reason 63. Serpent and centipede remedies medical nightmares. In the dark art of folk medicine, some Tudor healers believed that inserting live creatures, eels, smooth snakes, or even centipedes into the body could draw out hidden poisons. These horrifying procedures, performed without anesthesia or antiseptic, tore at vulnerable tissues. Imagine a trembling hand guiding a writhing serpent into the depths of the womb, its movements ripping delicate lining and carrying deadly bacteria. Such cures not only failed to heal, but wrought devastating infections, abscesses, and sepsis. Women emerged from these raids on their bodies scarred and haunted, their faith in local healers shattered. The terror lingered in their nightmares, reinforcing a profound distrust of any remedy, however traditional, and instilling the belief that the body itself was a battleground for cruel, misguided science. Reason 64. Postpartum dryness intercourse as torture. After childbirth, a woman's body was far from restored. The delicate mucosal tissues, frayed by delivery and crude suturing, often lost their natural lubrication, leaving intercourse intolerably painful. Midwives, ignorant of moisture's importance, offered no salves or soothing ointments beyond vinegar rinses that only stung further. A woman's duty remained to resume conjugal relations within days of birth, even as her body screamed with each attempt. Tears and red welts marked the aftermath, but she dared not protest, lest her refusal be deemed sinful or disobedient. The bedroom became an arena of silent agony, and desire curdled into dread. Over time, many women learned to feign readiness, their hearts recoiling at the mere approach of a husband's embrace. their bodies locked in a cycle of enforced torment that smothered any spark of affection. Reason 65. Obstetric fistula, a lifelong wound. Perhaps the cruelest consequence of Tudor childbirth was the obstetric fistula, a perforation between the birth canal and the urinary or gastrointestinal tract. With no surgical repair available, women leaked urine or feces uncontrollably, their bodies betrayed in the most intimate way. Shame and isolation followed them like shadows. Even the closest family members recoiled from the stench and the stain. Social exclusion was swift. Neighbours barred from visits, church pews left empty, and adoring glances replaced by pity or disgust. In the privacy of their own homes, women wept into tattered cloths, longing for love but fearing the very touch that might reveal their secret. Day after day, they lived under the weight of perpetual wound, each droplet a reminder of motherhood's cost, and each interaction a test of humanity's capacity for mercy. Reason 66. No right to divorce marriage without escape. In Tudor England, divorce was virtually unattainable. A woman battered physically or emotionally had no legal path to end her marriage. Only in rare circumstances, such as proving the union was never valid in the first place, could a case be brought before the ecclesiastical courts. Even then, the process dragged on for years, conducted in public view, forcing women to relive every humiliation. The cost in both coin and reputation deterred most from even trying. As a result, wives found themselves bound till death do us part, in unions that might be abusive, joyless, or dangerous. With no recourse and no sanctuary, many endured silent suffering, learning to hide bruises beneath heavy skirts and stifling cries behind closed doors. The notion of freedom from a loveless or violent marriage was as distant as the stars, impossible to grasp, but casting a long, sorrowful shadow. Reason 67. No sick leave illness without respite. Tudor women had no concept of medical leave or any form of social insurance. If illness struck, whether a sexually transmitted infection, a prolapsed uterus, or complications after childbirth, there was no legitimate excuse to remain in bed. Households expected every woman to cook, wash, and care for children and elderly kin, regardless of her own failing health. A single day's absence was deemed slothful, gossip spreading that a lazy wife threatened the family's honour. Overworked and undernourished, many chronic conditions worsened unaddressed, leading to long-term disability or even death. The body's desperate plea for rest was ignored, and recovery was left to prayer rather than proper care. In that unyielding environment, sickness was not an ailment, but a moral failing. Reason 68. No age of consent underage abuse. There was no legal recognition of a minimum age for sexual consent. Girls as young as 12 could be coerced into marriage, and by extension, into sex without any notion of protection or choice. The concept of childhood innocence held no sway against economic or familial pressure. On the wedding night, these girls endured bodily violation under the guise of fulfilling their marital duties. Their hearts were unprepared for the trauma, their bodies ill-equipped to withstand it. The scars, both physical and psychological, lasted a lifetime, shaping their views of love and trust. In this world, a child's body became an asset to be wielded by adults, with no law to shield her from predation. Reason 69. Lack of basic sex education, bodies mired in ignorance. No schools offered lessons in anatomy, menstruation cycles, contraception, or sexually transmitted infections. Women's understanding of their own bodies came from whispered rumours or cruel folklore. Painful intercourse was chalked up to nerves or melancholy, while discharge or itching was blamed on moral laxity. Misconceptions abounded, that pregnancy could be avoided by drinking cold water, or that nocturnal emissions were demonic visitations. Without factual guidance, women fell prey to dangerous practices, swallowing toxic herbs, inserting corrosive substances, or trusting untrained healers. Inadequate knowledge also bred fear. Many blamed themselves for maladies beyond their control, eroding self-worth, and making them easy targets for exploitation by unscrupulous practitioners. Reason 70. No emergency contraception morning after remedies denied. Even when acutely aware of an unwanted conception risk, Tudor women had no post-coital options. The concept of an emergency pill was unthinkable. Any herb or concoction rumoured to work after intercourse was forbidden, associated with witchcraft or forbidden knowledge. Consequently, many women faced the terror of an unintended pregnancy with no recourse. They watched their bodies change, powerless to halt the process they did not choose. The result was a cycle of despair. Countless daughters bearing children before womanhood had truly begun, and mothers whose health was already faltering forced to bear one more life. In a society that refused to acknowledge their basic right to bodily autonomy, the absence of emergency contraception sealed their fate to an unrelenting reproductive destiny. Reason 71. No concept of safe sex. In Tudor England, the very idea of barrier protection gloves, masks, or rudimentary condoms was utterly alien. There were no guidelines to limit the number of partners, no emphasis on sterilizing instruments or washing hands before and after intimacy. Sexual relations existed solely for the purpose of procreation, and hygiene was an afterthought at best. Couples lay together without knowledge of how infection traveled, unaware that wounds, sores, or even simple sweat could carry disease from one body to another. A single encounter could spark an outbreak of affliction, sweeping through a household and then an entire village, all because no one had ever considered protecting themselves in these most personal of acts. Reason 72. No support services for sexual violence victims. If a woman was raped by a stranger, a neighbor, or even her husband, she found no refuge in law or charity. Civil courts refused to hear her cries, deeming such matters private. Churches offered prayers and penance, but no medical care or counseling. There were no shelters where survivors could recover in safety, no midwives trained to treat the wounds of violence, and no compassionate hands to hold in the aftermath. She bore her trauma alone, her body aching and her spirit broken, with no trusted confidant to guide her toward healing. In silence, she carried the scars both visible and unseen throughout her daily tasks, a ghost haunting her own home. Reason 73. No protection for reproductive disabilities. Women suffering from uterine prolapse, fistula, or congenital reproductive anomalies lived branded by stigma. Lacking any government or communal safety net, these vulvar and vaginal injuries were met with scorn rather than care. Villagers whispered that such afflictions were punishments for sin or signs of weakness. Without reconstructive surgery or even supportive garments, these women endured chronic pain, difficulty walking, and a profound sense of shame. Their partners often withdrew, fearing contamination, and communities shut them out of social gatherings. In a world with no prosthesis or specialized physicians, they existed on the margins, their needs unseen and unaddressed. Reason 74. No reconstructive medical techniques. When childbirth or injury left the vaginal tissue torn, the Tudor medical repertoire offered no delicate sutures or antiseptic dressings. There were no specialized instruments to repair mucosal linings or restore elasticity, only rough stitching by untrained hands. The result was scar tissue that contracted and hardened, causing pain during subsequent intimacy and often leading to secondary infections. Women lost not only the capacity for safe, comfortable intercourse, but also the ability to bear children normally. Each scar became a silent testament to medical neglect, reminding them daily of a body that could neither heal nor find solace. Reason 75. No concern for quality of sexual life. In that era, sex was valued only as a means to an end a child. No one considered the joy of mutual pleasure, the warmth of emotional connection, or the nurturing of physical intimacy. Women were not taught how to care for themselves in bed, to explore their own desire, or to foster closeness with their husbands beyond the mechanical act. Marriage became a sequence of duty-bound encounters, devoid of tenderness or affection. Over time, couples drifted apart, each meeting resembling a cold transaction rather than the sharing of hearts. The absence of conversation about desire and satisfaction left marriages barren in spirit as well as in the bedroom. Reason 76. Widows forced to remarry, choice denied. When a husband died, his widow was swiftly courted by relatives, eager to secure alliances or protect property lines. Within weeks, sometimes days, she was expected to wed again, often to a stranger chosen with little thought for her grief or health. Physical exhaustion from childbirth or chronic illness mattered not. Her body was treated as a bargaining chip in marital politics. She had no voice in choosing her new partner, no time to mourn the life she had lost, and no guarantee of respect or safety in her next union. Stripped of autonomy, she moved from one marriage contract to another, her personal sorrow swallowed by the demands of fortune and family strategy. Reason 77. No ownership of one's own body, marriage as enslavement. Under the doctrine of coverture, the moment a woman wed, her legal existence was absorbed by her husband. She could not sign contracts, hold property, or make medical decisions, her body itself regarded as his estate. In the eyes of the law, he held title to her person. He could transfer assets, arrange her labor, or even lend her company to others in business or social dealings. Resistance was futile against this legal framework. Any assertion of autonomy met with swift censure or accusations of rebellion. In quiet moments, wives felt trapped within flesh they no longer commanded, yearning for even a whisper of self-determination. Reason 78. Licensed prostitution, regulated exploitation. In Tudor towns, prostitution was not merely tolerated but licensed, overseen by local authorities who collected fees from brothel keepers. Women and girls who sold sexual services lacked any labor protections. No health support, no legal recourse against abuse, no safety nets. Their workplaces were grim back rooms, lighted by flickering lamps, where violence and disease were constant threats. Town councils viewed these houses of ill repute as necessary social valves, a means to contain male desire, rather than condemn them as moral failings. The state regulated the women's bodies without offering them dignity or respect, marking them as commodities to be taxed rather than as people deserving care. Reason 79. Sexual violence against the poor, invisible and ignored. Servants, peasants, and impoverished women lived under the constant risk of sexual exploitation by masters or local officials. In a rigidly hierarchical society, their cries for justice found no audience. Their testimonies dismissed as untrustworthy, their status rendered them less worthy of legal protection. A manor lord could demand companionship behind closed doors with impunity, safe in the knowledge that no court would challenge him. Victims, stripped of any power, endured the trauma silently, fearing not only scorn, but also eviction or starvation if they spoke out. In these hush-hush tragedies, the bodies of the vulnerable became playgrounds for the powerful. Reason 80. No right to separation, marriage as confinement. If divorce was unattainable, legal separation was even more remote. A woman tormented by physical abuse or forced intimacy had no mechanism to live apart from her husband. There were no safe houses, no protective writs, and no communal welfare to turn to. Even if she fled, her community and church demanded her return, threatening excommunication or loss of any residual rights. Thus, many women remained cooped under one roof with their abusers, enduring endless cycles of violence and fear. The home, ideally a refuge, instead became an inescapable cell, where every door remained locked by law and custom alike. Reason 81. Public interrogations for divorce, hundredfold humiliation. In the exceedingly rare event a woman secured permission to seek a divorce, she faced the ecclesiastical court in open hearing. Before clergy, neighbors, and sometimes family members, she had to recite intimate details, infidelity, impotence, or abuse, and present witnesses to validate her claims. This ordeal amounted to a psychological gauntlet, each question dredging up painful memories in front of prying eyes. The courtroom's wooden benches became galleries of judgment, where whispers and stares branded her reputation. Even a successful petition left her branded as troubled or tainted, her name whispered in taverns and market squares for years afterward. In such a system, the mere act of seeking freedom required the sacrifice of one's dignity on a public scaffold of shame. Reason 82. Children as economic assets, relentless reproduction. In Tudor society, children were viewed as the future workforce and militia, prized above all for their labor potential. A woman's worth was measured by the number of offspring she could produce, regardless of her own health. Each pregnancy replenished the household's strength, adding hands for fields, mills, or hearth. Yet behind this veneer of prosperity lay a mother's sacrifice. Weakened frame, depleted nutrition, and a body worn thin by continuous gestation. She labored through morning sickness and back pain, often delivering again before her womb had fully recovered. While families counted heads to mark success, women counted their losses, health eroded, and spirits drained, bearing a burden no marketplace could value. Reason 83. No support for rape survivors, lives torn apart. Victims of rape had nowhere to turn. No medical clinics to treat injuries, no counselors to ease trauma, and no legal recourse to bring perpetrators to justice. A woman assaulted by a stranger, or even by her own husband, was left to endure physical pain and emotional torment in isolation. There were no safe houses, no advocacy groups, and no understanding that such violence was a crime rather than a moral failing. Survivors lived with lifelong fear, guilt, and shame, shunned by communities reluctant to acknowledge the horror. In the hush of night, many wept in silence, their trust shattered beyond repair. Reason 84. Infertility diminishes social standing. A woman's inability to bear a son, especially a male heir, rendered her status void. Without a male child to inherit land or title, she was branded unproductive, her reputation sullied. Gossip and whispers followed her through market squares and parish gatherings, labeling her a liability to both family and lineage. Property rights shifted away, dowries lost or reclaimed, and husbands looked to new alliances in hopes of securing a male successor. Stripped of social value and confronted with public scorn, infertile women faced the dual cruelty of personal grief and communal exclusion. Reason 85. Forced wet nursing, mother and child divided. Among the gentry, it was fashionable to employ wet nurses rather than nurse one's own infants. A mother's bond with her newborn was severed, as the child was handed to a peasant woman in damp cottages, while the biological mother remained distant, her milky supply declared too coarse for gentlemanly taste. Mothers recovered from childbirth in elegant beds, yet were forbidden to cradle their own babes for the sake of preserving slender figures. This separation often bred deep emotional wounds. Infants, denied maternal warmth, clung to strangers, and mothers, watching from afar, felt their hearts break in silence. The natural intimacy of breastfeeding was perverted, leaving both parties yearning for a closeness denied by custom. Reason 86. Childbirth in public, unwanted spectators. A Tudor woman giving birth seldom enjoyed the sanctity of privacy. Instead, she endured her labour in the presence of a dozen or more onlookers, midwives, neighbours, and sometimes local gentry crammed into a narrow doorway. These spectators gossiped and critiqued while she writhed in agonizing waves of pain. The steady thud of hurried footsteps and low hum of conversation echoed around her, amplifying anguish rather than offering comfort. She had no voice to plead for discretion or gentleness. Any cry for relief risked rebuke or scorn. In this unwanted theatre, her most vulnerable moment was transformed into a spectacle, stripping away dignity and leaving memories stained with humiliation rather than hope. Reason 87. Stitches without anesthesia, postpartum torment. When a woman's perineum tore during childbirth, there was no gentle hands to ease her pain. Instead, the village barber surgeon, or often the local carpenter, summoned for his steadiness of hand, seized coarse horsehair thread and crude needles. No laudanum, no opiate-soaked cloth, not even a drop of herbal balm to numb the agony. The mother, exhausted from hours of labour, found herself thrust back into fresh horror. Each brutal stitch slicing through raw, swollen flesh without mercy. Her screams echoed through the dimly lit chamber, mingling with the crackle of torch flames. Infection followed swiftly, as unsterile instruments introduced bacteria into her open wounds. Tissue necrosis set in, turning what should have been the first gift of new life into a chapter of unending suffering. In the sleepless nights that followed, memories of those unsparing sutures haunted every movement, a constant reminder that healing had been withheld in the name of necessity. Reason 88. Forced wet nursing, mother and child divided. Wealthy Tudor women, prized for their social standing, rarely nursed their own infants. Instead, a wet nurse, often a woman of lower status, sometimes even a bonded servant, took the child to her own squalid quarters, leaving the biological mother isolated from her own daughter or son. The infant, latched to a stranger's breast, learned comfort in foreign arms, while the mother's abundant milk was either discarded or sold. The separation inflicted deep emotional wounds on both sides. The child grew confused by conflicting attachments, and the mother felt a hollow ache in her chest, her nurturing purpose stripped away. In an era with no concept of postpartum bond, both mother and child were left adrift, their natural closeness severed by rigid social conventions. Reason 89. Dying in the act, silent, fatal consequences. A woman's body, weakened by successive pregnancies, and destined to fulfill her duty, sometimes gave way during the act of intimacy itself. The physical toll of chronic exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated infection could trigger a fatal heart attack, stroke, or catastrophic hemorrhage mid-coitus. In those fevered moments, with no midwife or physician within reach, she collapsed in her husband's arms, the very embrace intended for procreation becoming an unwitting executioner. No call for help, no rush of a gurney, only the sudden hush as life slipped away. The hushed aftermath spoke volumes about the dangers of enforced duty. Love's fulfillment transformed into the ultimate sacrifice, and the final breath drawn in the shadows of obligation. Reason 90. Chronic sexual violence, no path to recovery. Women subject to repeated assault, whether at the hands of predatory husbands or opportunistic neighbors, lived in a continuous cycle of physical and psychological torment. Yet Tudor society offered no sanctuary, no trauma-informed counsel, and no medical avenues for true recovery. Despair gnawed at their minds. They developed anxiety so profound that sleep became impossible, and depression that rooted itself in every waking thought. Their bodies bore wounds that never truly healed, while their spirits recoiled from any tender gesture. With no legal framework to hold their oppressors accountable, these women internalized blame, losing faith in both church and crown. Over time, intimate feelings withered completely, leaving them estranged from the very concept of trust and affection. Reason 91. Incurable venereal diseases bed as a chamber of torment. Beyond syphilis, which blighted bodies and minds alike, others suffered from gonorrhea, chlamydia, and the torments of tertiary infections. With no antibiotics or precise diagnostics, afflictions festered unchecked. Sores oozed, joints swelled in rheumatic agony, and nerves burned with constant, invisible flames. Mercury treatments, once hoped to help, instead devastated teeth, hair, and kidneys. The marital bed, a place of union, transformed into a crucible of shame and suffering. Partners recoiled at the sight of lesions, at the putrid odor of infection, fueling isolation and despair. In that intimate dark, the body betrayed itself, and every whisper of flesh-to-flesh contact risked deeper corruption disease as both punishment and curse with no hope of redemption. Reason 92. No sex education clueless about one's own body. In Tudor England, there were no anatomy classes, no pamphlets on reproductive health, and no trusted instructors to guide young people. Instead, information passed by word of mouth, often twisted by superstition or gleaned from watching livestock in the barn. A girl might think intercourse mirrored what she saw between pigs, while a boy assumed performance by watching horses. There was no understanding of germs, antibiotics, or diseases transmitted during intimacy. Terms like HIV or gonorrhea had no meaning. Bodies were mysteries to be endured rather than understood. Women entered marriage with no idea of menstrual cycles, fertility windows, or hygiene practices, and stumbled through their adult lives, shrouded in ignorance. This profound lack of education trapped generations in a cycle of pain, fear of illness, and deep shame, only discovering too late that their physiological autonomy had been stolen from the very start. Reason 93. Religious zealotry, bodily torture as purification. Some extremist sects in Tudor times believed that to atone for sin, one must subject the body, especially the regions tied to temptation, to ritualized pain. Women voluntarily or forcibly whipped themselves across the thighs and hips, believing that self-inflicted wounds would cleanse their souls. Others endured prolonged abstinence under threat of excommunication, wearing coarse hair shirts that chafed sensitive skin and pressed into their flesh with every movement. These austerities often led to infections that festered unchecked, and the trauma etched itself into memory, leaving women with lasting distrust of their own bodies. In the name of piety, faith became cruelty, turning intimate regions into battlegrounds for spiritual warfare rather than safe havens of comfort. Reason 94. No age of consent children as marriage bargains. In the Tudor legal framework, girls as young as 12 were deemed ready for marriage and motherhood. With no protective laws, these children became pawns in family alliances or dowry negotiations. On their wedding nights, their undeveloped bodies were thrust into acts they neither comprehended nor could physically endure. The result was often catastrophic: uterine tears, hemorrhage, and lifelong reproductive damage. Psychologically, These girls carried the weight of betrayal, their childhoods ending in an instant of trauma that echoed through their adult years. Without any concept of safeguarding minors, society sanctioned the exploitation of girls as perfectly normal practice, leaving scars that rarely healed. Reason 95. Untreated sexual dysfunctions blamed as sin. Erectile dysfunction in men, painful intercourse in women, low desire, or premature ejaculation were never recognized as medical issues in Tudor times. Instead, sufferers were branded sinners or punished by divine wrath. No physician offered targeted therapy, only prayers, fasts, or potentially toxic herbal concoctions. Couples lived in a fog of misunderstanding. A husband's inability to perform was seen as spiritual weakness, and a wife's discomfort in bed was attributed to moral failings. Without counseling or proper diagnosis, suspicions of infidelity and marital discord festered. Partners blamed each other for shortcomings beyond anyone's control, and the absence of sympathetic, scientific care transformed private struggles into public shame. Reason 96. Death, the final escape. For many Tudor women, death was the only conceivable release from relentless reproductive demands, unending domestic duties, and the weight of sexual and physical violence. Suicide was regarded as the gravest sin, an eternal condemnation, yet countless women saw no alternative. Some ingested poisonous herbs, trusting their bodies to merciful collapse. Others inflicted wounds upon themselves, each cut a desperate plea for respite. A few starved themselves until life slipped away, believing that in death they might find the peace denied in life. In quiet chambers, these women embraced mortality not as tragedy but as salvation, the ultimate freedom from cycles of pain and oppression that had begun in their earliest childhoods and never ceased until the final breath. Reason 97. No maternity leave forced back to work. In Tudor England, there was no notion of recovery after childbirth. Within 2 or 3 days of delivering a baby, women were expected back in the fields or at their looms. Their bodies, still raw from tearing and stitching, were pressed into bending over soil or bending over spindles. Mothers toted infants in one arm while gripping plough handles with the other, each jolt threatening to burst stitches and unleash hemorrhages. Postpartum bleeding often returned in torrents, yet there was no one to say, "Rest." Infection crept in through unhealed wounds, turning the simple act of work into a perilous gamble with life itself. In this world, the idea of cradle songs was replaced by the relentless rhythm of labor, a lullaby of exhaustion and survival. Reason 98. No health insurance, sky, high treatment costs. Every remedy, whether an herbal poultice, an apothecary's tincture, or a barber surgeon's blade, came with a price that families often could not afford. A woman too poor to pay was left waiting, fevered and weak as infections festered. Even a small dose of gentler medicines cost a handful of coins, a sum beyond the reach of many. Without funds, a mother might skip the midwife's fee, rely on home-brewed teas that only prolonged suffering, and hide fevers until delirium. Death by preventable causes was common. The poor died whispered deaths in unlit hovels, because they lacked 2 or 3 pennies for a safer stitch or a cleansing salve. In Tudor economy, life was weighed against coin, and those empty of both were left to the mercy of chance. Reason 99. No recognition of abuse silenced suffering. Tudor law drew a firm line around domestic matters, rendering any violence within marriage or family off limits to legal intervention. A woman beaten or violated by her husband or kin found no sanctuary in courts or church tribunals. Clergy labelled such brutality marital correction or family discipline, refusing to see it as an assault on the person. Civil authorities, wary of prying into private homes, turned away petitions for help. Victims learned to swallow their screams, wrap bruises beneath layers of wool, and maintain the facade of a peaceful household. In hushed corners, they counted each strike as another weight on their hearts, each silence another lock on the door of justice. Reason 100. Irresponsible fathers, single mothers, left to bear the burden. When a woman conceived outside wedlock, whether by choice or coercion, there was no guarantee of paternal support. Fathers, whether seducers or rapists, faced no obligations to provide food, clothing, or shelter for the child. The mother, already vulnerable, was left to scrounge work wherever she could, laundry, spinning, or begging scraps. Society judged her harshly for her transgression, while ignoring the man who walked away unscathed. Without arms or poor relief, many single mothers sank into destitution, forced to thrust their infants into foundling homes where survival was a lottery. The absence of any child support system condemned both mother and child to a life of precarious poverty and social scorn. Reason 101. Short lifespan paid for every agony. Combining relentless childbirth, untreated infections, malnutrition, violence, and the hazards of dirty labor, it is little wonder that the average Tudor woman seldom reached her 50th year. Many succumbed around 35 to 40, worn down by decades of pain. Each pregnancy, each stitch without a sedative, each forced return to labor chipped away at her vitality. The cumulative trauma, bodily and mental, eroded any chance of old age. In their final breaths, they carried the weight of a lifetime of survival. A testament to endurance, but also a stark reminder that in Tudor times, longevity was the rarest gift, stolen early by the very systems meant to sustain life. And so, dear listener, as we draw the curtain on our journey through those shadowed halls of Tudor life, let us gently slow our breath and allow the echoes of history's harsh lessons to soften into distant, almost forgotten murmurs. Imagine, if you will, a quiet twilight meadow where the last pale light of day drifts lazily across soft grass, and each blade seems to whisper that even in the bleakest of times, compassion and hope can take root. Recall that this story, though steeped in sorrow, carries within it a reminder of resilience and the indomitable human spirit. For every woman who endured these trials also carried within her the spark of survival, the quiet courage that ultimately shaped our world's journey toward justice and empathy. In these hushed moments, allow yourself to feel the weight of the past lift, as though a gentle breeze stirs through the trees, carrying away the ache and the anguish. Know that the stories we've shared hold value beyond mere facts. They ask us to honor those who suffered, to remember that every step forward in human rights and understanding has been built upon the sacrifices of countless souls. And in remembering, we pledge to cherish the freedoms we enjoy, the right to bodily autonomy, to care and healing, to empathy and support for one another. Let the last images of cold chambers, of silent tears, and of relentless toil fade now into a mist of compassion, settling softly like petals upon still water. Picture, instead, a single, glowing candle, its flame small but unwavering, illuminating the promise that no darkness is absolute, and every life, however mistreated, has kindled the light of progress. That light spills outward now, coloring your thoughts with warmth and gratitude, as you cradle this moment between wakefulness and slumber. As you drift toward rest, carry with you the quiet assurance that you are part of a living tapestry of change, that your empathy and your voice continue the work begun centuries ago. Allow your mind to drift to a place of comfort, perhaps the gentle rocking of a cradle, the distant song of crickets at dusk, or the warmth of a loved one's hand softly holding yours. Let go of every tension, every worry, as your eyelids grow heavy and your breath becomes a steady lullaby. And now, in the softest of whispers, thank you for traveling this path with me tonight. May your dreams be filled with peace, and may you awaken with renewed compassion for all who came before. If you have found value in these stories and seek more gentle explorations of the past's hidden truths, please subscribe and join our circle where each new video is crafted with care, offering the very best of history's lessons and reflections. Sleep well, dear friend, and good night.